3 weeks had passed since the demonstration that shocked the Galactic. Defense Academy instructor Kethril Vaughn stood at the edge of the training arena and watched as Sergeant Una Park addressed her first official classes. 4 arms were still wrapped in support bandages, but the doctors had cleared him for light observation duty. He would not miss this moment for anything. The arena that had held 3,000 spectators for their fight now held only 50 carefully selected students. They represented the most promising cadets from a dozen coalition species, and every single one of them had volunteered for this experimental program commander. Dorvan Sek stood in the front row beside Vaughn, and his massive gray form made the cadets around him look like children. He had kept his word about being Una's first student, and he bore the bruises to prove it. Cadet Morel Thomases sat in her usual position with recording equipment active. The Coalition Council had requested complete documentation of this new training program, and her telepathic sensitivity made her the ideal observer. Una walked to the center of the ring and looked at her students with an expression that mixed warmth with steel. You all saw what happened in this arena 3 weeks ago, and you know what human combat looks like when applied without restraint. She paused and let her words sink in. Today, I'm going to teach you something more important than technique, and more valuable than any single fighting style. The cadets leaned forward, and their various sensory organs focused on the small human who had defeated a legend. I am going to teach you how to think like a human, and how to approach combat as a problem to be solved, rather than a contest of natural advantages. She began to walk among the students, and her footsteps made no sound on the arena floor. Every species in this room has natural weapons of some kind, and you have claws and venom and telepathy, and armored hide and regeneration and raw physical power. She stopped beside a young Krylosi, whose gray skin was mottled with the patterns of adolescence. What do humans have? The cadet hesitated and then spoke in a deep, rumbling voice. Nothing, Sergeant, and your species has no natural weapons that we have identified. Correct, and yet I defeated Instructor Vaughn using only my bare hands. She moved on to a Villani student whose silver eyes tracked her movements. How is that possible, Cadet Thomases? Morel stood and faced her instructor with the confidence of someone who had spent weeks analyzing exactly that question. Because you understand anatomy and leverage and timing better than any species we have encountered, and because you have developed systematic methods for exploiting weaknesses that we do not even know we possess. Partially correct, but you are missing the most important factor. Una returned to the center of the ring and turned to face the entire class. Humans won because we had to, and our homeworld gave us no choice but to become the most efficient predators our planet had ever produced. She raised one hand, and the cadets saw the calluses on her knuckles and the slight crookedness of fingers that had been broken and healed multiple times. We did not evolve claws, so we learned to make our fists into weapons, and we did not evolve armor, so we learned to avoid being hit, and we did not evolve superior strength, so we learned to use our opponent's strength against them. Vaughn stepped forward, despite his injuries, and his voice carried across the arena. May I add something, Sergeant? Una nodded and gestured for him to speak. When I fought Sergeant Park, I made the mistake that most species make when facing humans for the first time, and I assumed that her lack of natural weapons meant she was weak. He walked slowly to stand beside her, and the contrast between them was striking. He towered over her with 4 powerful arms and scales that gleamed under the arena lights. She looked like she might blow away in a strong wind. What I learned is that humans are not weak, and they have simply chosen to hide their strength until they need it. He turned to face the students. I have 40 cycles of combat experience, and I did not see her attacks coming until they had already landed, and I could not predict her movements, because she does not fight the way any species fights. Why is that? A Draxian cadet asked from the 3rd row. Because human combat evolved from 10,000 years of humans fighting each other. Una answered, Every technique I used against Instructor Vaughn was originally designed to defeat opponents who knew exactly how humans fight and who had trained their entire lives to counter human attacks. She smiled slightly. Compared to fighting another human master, fighting an alien species is almost simple. The cadets exchanged glances, and some of them shifted uncomfortably. They had come here expecting to learn exotic techniques from a species that had somehow gotten lucky against a single opponent now. They were beginning to understand that they had volunteered to train with a species that had spent millennia perfecting the art of causing harm. Your first lesson begins now, Yuna said, and her voice hardened. Everyone find a partner of approximately equal size and face each other. The cadets scrambled to obey, and soon the arena floor was covered with pairs of students, standing awkwardly across from their partners. I want each of you to attack your partner with whatever technique you would normally use in combat, and do not hold back, but do not cause permanent injury. She watched as the pairs began to spar, and her eyes tracked every movement. Now I want the defenders to close their eyes and continue fighting. Chaos erupted as cadets who relied on vision suddenly found themselves stumbling, and flailing attacks that had been easily countered moments ago now landed without resistance. Stop. The arena fell silent instantly. What did you learn from that exercise? A Vellani cadet whose silver skin was already bruising spoke up. That we rely too heavily on our primary senses. Correct, and what else? Commander Sek answered this time, and his deep voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom, that our natural advantages become weaknesses when an enemy knows how to exploit them, and I rely on my size and strength to intimidate opponents before combat even begins, and you ignored that entirely. Exactly, Commander. Yuna walked among the students again, and her presence seemed to fill the arena despite her small size. Humans learned long ago that every advantage has a corresponding weakness, and the bigger you are, the harder you fall, and the more arms you have, the more joints that can be targeted, and the thicker your armor, the more you neglect the places it does not cover. She stopped in the center of the ring. I am going to teach you to see those weaknesses in any opponent, and to exploit them without mercy when necessary, and to calibrate your response to the threat level you face. Thomas's raised her hand. Sergeant, how do you maintain control during intense combat? And I felt your mind during your fight with Instructor Vaughn, and there was no loss of discipline, even when you were clearly dominant. That is the most important lesson I can teach you, and it is also the hardest. Yuna turned to face the young Vellani. Human martial arts are not just physical techniques, and they are mental disciplines that teach you to remain calm and analytical, even when your body is flooded with combat hormones. She tapped her temple. We train our minds as much as our bodies, because the mind is what separates a warrior from a mere fighter. Vaughn spoke again. I have already experienced the benefits of this training firsthand in Commander Sek has been working with Sergeant Park for 2 weeks, and the changes in his combat style are remarkable. Sek nodded, and his gray face showed rare humility. I am slower and weaker than most opponents I face, but Sergeant Park has taught me to use positioning and timing to negate those disadvantages, and for the first time in decades, I feel like I am learning something genuinely new. The class continued for 3 more hours, and Yuna guided her students through exercises that challenged everything they thought they knew about combat. By the end, every single cadet was exhausted and bruised, and absolutely certain that they wanted to continue training. As the class filed out of the arena, Thomas lingered behind. Sergeant Park, may I ask you something personal? Yuna nodded and began collecting the training equipment. When you defeated Instructor Vaughn, you could have killed him at any time, but you chose not to, and I felt your mind throughout the fight, and there was never any bloodlust or killing intent, even when you were at your most dangerous. That is correct. How is that possible, and how can you be that deadly without losing yourself to violence? Yuna paused and looked at the young Vellani with something like affection. Because violence is not the point Cadet Thomas's, and it never was. She set down the equipment and faced her student directly. Humans developed combat arts because we needed to protect ourselves, and our families and our communities. And we became deadly because the alternative was extinction. Her dark eyes held centuries of hard-won wisdom. But we also developed ethics and philosophy and law because we understood that unlimited violence would destroy us as surely as any predator, and the same discipline that makes us dangerous also makes us capable of mercy. She smiled and placed one hand on Thuis's shoulder. I did not spare Instructor Vaughn because I was holding back, and I spared him because killing him was never my goal. And my goal was to teach him something, and that goal was accomplished without permanent harm. Thomas processed this information and slowly began to understand something fundamental about the species she had been documenting. Humans were not simply Death World survivors who had learned to fight. They were philosophers of violence who had spent 10,000 years grappling with question. The medical bay was quiet, except for the soft hum of healing equipment and the occasional beep of monitoring systems. Vaughn lay on a diagnostic bed designed for his species, and his forearms were immobilized while the regeneration fields worked on his damaged tissues. The medical officer in charge was a Volani named Counselor Thrain, and he had served at the academy for 15 cycles. He had never seen injuries quite like these. The damage is extensive, but surprisingly precise. He told Commander Sek, who stood at the foot of the bed. Whoever did this knew exactly how much force to apply, and exactly where to apply it. Sek nodded grimly, and his gray face was troubled. Sergeant Park claimed she was holding back, and I did not believe her until I saw your report. She was telling the truth, and in fact, I would say she was being modest. Thrain pulled up a holographic display showing Vaughn's nervous system highlighted in red and gold. Every single injury is to a nerve cluster or muscle insertion point, and not one vital organ was touched despite the intensity of the combat. He zoomed in on one of the damaged areas. This level of anatomical precision requires either extensive study of Draxian physiology or the ability to read an opponent's body language so accurately that vulnerabilities become obvious in real time. And which do you think it was? Both probably, and that is what concerns me. Sek turned to look at the observation window where Una Park sat in a chair waiting patiently for her own medical examination. She had not complained about her injuries and had simply asked to speak with Vaughn when he recovered. She's waiting for something, Sek said, and he was not sure if he was asking a question. She wants to talk to me, Vaughn said from the bed, and his voice was weak but coherent. Sek turned back to find the Draxian instructor struggling to sit up despite the immobilization fields. You should rest, and whatever you need to discuss can wait. No, it cannot, and I need to understand what happened in that arena. Vaughn's amber eyes were clear, despite the pain medication flowing through his system. I have trained warriors for 40 cycles. Commander and I have never been beaten so thoroughly, and I need to know how she did it. Sek considered refusing, but he recognized the look in Vaughn's eyes. It was the same expression he had seen in young cadets who had just discovered their calling, and in veterans who had found new purpose after years of stagnation. Whatever had happened in that arena had changed something fundamental in Kethral Vaughn. I will allow a brief conversation, but the medical staff has final authority over when it ends. He walked to the observation window and gestured for Una to enter. She rose smoothly despite her bruised ribs and split lip and followed him into the medical bay. Vaughn watched her approach, and he noticed things that he had missed during their fight. The way she moved with her weight always centered and her hands never fully relaxed. The way her eyes scanned the room, automatically cataloging exits and potential threats. The way she positioned herself so that she could see both him and Commander Sek without turning her head. These were not conscious behaviors, and they were ingrained habits that had been drilled into her body through years of training and practice. Instructor Vaughn wished to speak with you, Sek said, and he stepped back to observe the interaction. Yuna nodded and moved closer to the diagnostic bed. How are you feeling? Like I was trampled by a herd of Grothian megabeasts. Vaughn managed a weak laugh that turned into a cough. My students will never let me forget this humiliation. There is no humiliation in losing to a technique you have never encountered before. Yuna's voice was gentle now, and completely different from the cold tone she had used during their fight. You adapted faster than most opponents would have, and if you had faced a less experienced human, you might have won. You are being generous, and we both know I never had a chance once you decided to stop playing. Vaughn shifted on the bed and winced as the movement aggravated his injuries. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. I will try. At any point during our fight, could you have killed me? The question hung in the air, and Sek tensed as he waited for the answer Yuna was silent for a long moment, and her dark eyes met Vaughn's amber gaze without flinching. Yes, and there were at least 7 opportunities where a slight change in targeting would have caused fatal damage. Vaughn closed his eyes and let out a slow breath. I suspected as much, but I needed to hear you say it. Is that why you wanted to talk to me? Partly, but I also wanted to understand something else. He opened his eyes again, and his expression was curious rather than hostile. When you had me in that choking hold, at the end I was completely helpless, and you could have done anything you wanted. Yes, but you released me immediately when the commander ordered you to stop, and there was no hesitation and no reluctance. Yuna tilted her head slightly and a faint smile crossed her face. You are asking how I can switch between those two states so easily. I am asking how you can be that dangerous and still maintain that level of control. And I have seen berserker species who cannot stop themselves once combat begins, and I have seen cold calculating predators who kill without emotion. Vaughn's voice grew more intense. You are neither of those things, and during our fight you were fully committed to causing me harm, but you were also constantly calculating exactly how much harm to cause. That is what human martial arts are designed to teach. Yuna moved to sit in a chair beside his bed, and something in her posture relaxed slightly. Our species has been fighting each other for our entire history, and we developed combat systems that allow for levels of escalation. She held up one hand and curled her fingers into a fist. A human can punch someone in a bar fight and break their nose without killing them, or they can use the same fist to strike a throat and cause death. She uncurled her fingers slowly. The difference is not in the technique, but in the intent, and we train to control that intent so that we always choose how much damage we cause. Sek stepped forward, and his expression was troubled. You are describing something that should not be possible, and combat triggers survival instincts that override rational thought in every species we have studied. Humans are different, and we evolved as social predators who had to cooperate to survive. Yuna turned to face the commander. If our ancestors lost control every time they fought, they would have killed their own tribe members, and the entire species would have gone extinct. She shrugged with a casualness that seemed out of place given the topic. So we evolved the ability to modulate our aggression and to fight at different levels of intensity depending on the situation, and our training methods enhance that natural ability until it becomes automatic. Vaughn processed this information, and suddenly many things that had confused him began to make sense. That is why you let me hit you in the beginning, and you were reading my intent and deciding how to respond. Exactly. And when you were just trying to win a sparring match, I responded with controlled demonstration techniques. Yuna's expression grew more serious. But when you dropped into a killing stance and attacked with genuine lethal intent, I matched your escalation. And when I grabbed you and tried to crush you moved from wanting to hurt me to wanting to kill me, and I responded by incapacitating you as efficiently as possible. Sek felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm temperature of the medical bay. He had commanded warriors from dozens of species, and he thought he understood the nature of violence. Now he realized that humans have been studying and refining violence for longer than most. Coalition species had possessed written language. Sergeant Park, I believe the Coalition has significantly underestimated your species, he said, and his voice was carefully controlled. We have been treating humans as primitive newcomers who need guidance and protection. Una stood and faced him with that same calm, steady gaze. We are newcomers to the galactic community, Commander, and we do need guidance in many areas. She paused, and something flickered in her dark eyes. But we are not primitive, and we have simply been polite because we wanted to make a good impression. And now I think the Coalition should understand what humanity actually brings to this alliance. She glanced at Vaughn, who was watching the exchange with growing respect. Not just our persistence and adaptability and creativity, but also our capacity for controlled violence when it becomes necessary. Vaughn spoke up from his bed. I want to learn from you, Sergeant Park, and not just how to defend against your techniques, but how to fight the way you do. Una turned back to him and raised one eyebrow. You want a human to teach you combat? I want the warrior who defeated me to teach me how to be better, and I do not care what species she belongs to. For the first time since she arrived at the academy, Una Park allowed herself to smile genuinely. I would be honored. Instructor Vaughn, Commander Sec, watched the exchange and made a decision that would change the future of Coalition military training. Sergeant Park, I am expanding your role at this academy effective immediately, and human close combat instruction will become a mandatory part of the advanced curriculum. He straightened to his full, impressive height. I will be your first student after instructor. Vaughn recovers, and I want to understand exactly what we have been missing about your species. The medical officer Thrain looked up from his diagnostic equipment with an expression of alarm. Commander, with respect, I am not certain that is wise given what we just witnessed. That is exactly why it is wise, Counselor, and if humans are going to be our allies. Vaughn's forehands closed on empty air as Una slipped beneath his grasping arms and drove her knee into his thigh. Strike hit the same nerve cluster she had targeted before, and his leg buckled immediately. She did not wait for him to recover, and her elbow came up into his shin with enough force to snap his head backward. Blood sprayed from his mouth where he had bitten his own tongue, and before the droplets had even hit the floor, she had struck him 3 more times. Each blow landed on a point she had already damaged during the earlier exchange, and the accumulated trauma made his nervous system scream with amplified agony. The crowd watched in stunned silence as their legendary instructor was systematically dismantled by a creature half his size. Avon swung wildly with his upper arms, and Una caught one wrist and redirected the strike so that he punched himself in the face with his own fist. It should have been humiliating, but no one laughed because there was nothing funny about what they were witnessing. This was not a sparring match anymore, and it was not even a fight. It was a demonstration of exactly how dangerous humans could be when they stopped pretending to be. Civilized Thos gripped her recording device with trembling hands and forced herself to keep documenting. The telepathic overflow from Vaughn's pain and fear was almost overwhelming, but she understood that this record would become one of the most important documents in Coalition military history. The human was not fighting like any species Thomases had ever observed. Predator species attacked with overwhelming force and tried to end conflicts. Quickly, prey species fought defensively and looked for opportunities to escape. Una did neither. She pressed forward constantly, but her attacks were measured and precise rather than wild and desperate. Every strike served a purpose, and no energy was wasted on flashy movements or intimidation displays. She was methodically destroying Vaughn's ability to fight, and she was doing it with the cold efficiency of a surgeon performing an operation. Vaughn finally managed to grab her with his 2 lower arms and wrap them around her torso in a crushing embrace. His species could generate enough pressure to crack starship hull plating, and surely this tiny human would simply break in his grip. Una did not struggle or panic instead. She headbutted him directly in the snout, and the crack of impact echoed through the arena. Vaughn's grip loosened for just a moment. And that moment was enough. She twisted in a way that seemed impossible for a creature with a rigid skeleton, and somehow slipped free of his arms. Before he could grab her again, she had swept his legs and sent him crashing to the floor. The impact shook the arena, and Yuna was on top of him before he stopped bouncing, her arm wrapped around his throat in a hold that the coalition had never seen, and she squeezed with grip strength that should not have existed in such a small body. Vaughn thrashed with all four arms, and his tail whipped frantically against the floor. He tried to pry her arm away, and tried to reach behind himself to grab her, and tried to roll over and crush her beneath. His greater mass, nothing worked. Yuna held her position, with legs wrapped around his torso, and one arm locked around his throat, and she simply endured everything he threw at her. Seconds passed, and Vaughn's struggles grew weaker as blood flow to his brain was restricted. His amber eyes began to lose focus, and his forearms fell to his sides one by one. Commander Sek finally rushed forward and grabbed Yuna's shoulder. Enough, he bellowed, and his deep voice cracked with something close to fear. Release him now, Sergeant. Yuna let go immediately and stood up with the same calm expression she had worn at the beginning of the match. Vaughn lay on the floor, gasping for air, and his forearms twitched uselessly as his nervous system tried to recover from the sustained assault. The arena remained silent for a long moment, and then someone in the back began to clap. The sound was slow and uncertain at first, but it spread through the crowd until the entire assembly was applauding. They were not cheering for violence, and they were applauding something they had never expected to see. A human had defeated a Draxian warrior in single combat using nothing but bare hands and tactical thinking. Yuna ignored the applause and knelt beside Vaughn with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Can you hear me, instructor?" she asked, and her voice had lost its cold edge. Vaughn opened his eyes and stared at her with an expression that mixed hatred and confusion and reluctant respect. "How?" he managed to rasp. "How did you do that to me? I targeted your nervous system rather than trying to overpower your muscles," she explained as if she were teaching a class. "Your species has redundant organs and thick scales, but your nerve clusters are actually closer to the surface than most coalition species." She helped him sit up, and he was too dazed to refuse her assistance. "I also attacked the same points repeatedly to cause cumulative damage, and your pain receptors became more sensitive with each strike, which made every subsequent hit more effective." Vaughn shook his head slowly and winced as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through his battered body. 40 cycles I have trained warriors, and I have never seen techniques like those, because most species rely on their natural advantages, and humans have none. Yuna sat back on her heels and regarded him with something almost like sympathy. "We had to learn how to kill things much stronger than ourselves, or we would have gone extinct long before we invented fire." The medical team rushed onto the arena floor and began scanning Vaughn with their diagnostic equipment. Their expressions grew increasingly alarmed as they cataloged his injuries. Severe soft tissue damage across multiple muscle groups and nerve inflammation in at least 12 locations, and minor fractures in 2 of his arm joints, all of this from a creature who weighed perhaps a quarter of what he did. Commander Sek stood over the scene, and his gray face was unreadable. "Sergeant Park, I require an explanation for what just happened here." Yuna rose to her feet and met his gaze. Without flinching, Instructor Vaughn challenged me to a live combat demonstration, and I accepted. That was not a demonstration, and that was an assault. With respect, Commander, he escalated to lethal intent first, and I responded appropriately while ensuring no permanent damage. She gestured to Vaughn, who is now being helped onto a medical stretcher. "He will be fully recovered within a few weeks, and I deliberately avoided any strikes that could cause lasting harm." Sek stared at her for a long moment, and the implications of her words slowly became clear. She had been holding back even while she was brutalizing a Draxian warrior. She had consciously chosen to cause pain without permanent injury, and that required a level of control that he could barely comprehend. "You could have killed him," Sek said, and it was not a question Yuna did not answer, but her silence was answer. Inathis finally lowered her recording device and took a shaky breath. She had felt the human's mind throughout the entire fight, and she knew something that no one else in the arena understood. Even at the end, when Yuna had been choking Vaughn unconscious, she had maintained complete conscious control. Every strike had been calculated, and every movement had been intentional. The human had never lost herself to rage or instinct or the heat of battle. She had simply decided to demonstrate exactly how dangerous her species could be. And then she had executed that decision with perfect precision. That was more terrifying than any display of strength or speed. Could ever Beatty stretcher carrying Vaughn passed by Yuna, and the Draxian reached out with one trembling arm. "Wait," he said to the medical team, and they paused. He looked at the human who had destroyed him so completely and asked the only question that mattered. "Why did you let me hit you earlier when you could have avoided everything?" Yuna considered the question for a moment before answering. "Because you needed to believe you could win, and overconfidence creates openings that skill alone cannot exploit." She paused, and something that might have been respect entered her voice. "You fought well once you stopped underestimating me, and in a real battle I would not have escaped without serious injuries." Vaughn processed this information, and slowly a different expression replaced the pain and confusion on his scaled face. It was the look of a warrior who had learned something valuable and who recognized a superior opponent. "I request a rematch," he said, and his voice was stronger now. "When I have recovered, I want to face you again." Yuna smiled for the first time since the match began. "I would like that, Instructor Vaughn, and next time I will teach you how to defend against what I did today." The medical team carried him away, and Yuna turned to face Commander Sek. The arena had gone quiet again, as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Sek looked at the small human standing before him and realized that everything the coalition thought they knew about humanity needed to be revised immediately. Vaughn's lunge was perfect, and his forearms came at Yuna from different angles in a pattern that had trapped hundreds of opponents before. His upper right arm swept toward her head, while his upper left aimed for her shoulder, and his two lower arms reached to grab her torso and pin her in place. It was a capture technique designed to immobilize enemies so that the Draxian's superior strength could finish the fight. Yuna moved her body, dropped low, and twisted sideways, and suddenly she was inside his guard, where his long arms became awkward rather than advantageous. Her left hand caught his lower right wrist and redirected his own momentum against him, while her right hand struck the nerve cluster beneath his secondary arm. Van gasped as unexpected pain shot through his limb, and before he could process what had happened, she struck again. Precise hit to his throat made him choke, and a third strike behind his knee buckled his leg and sent him staggering backward. 3 strikes in less than 2 seconds, and every single one had found a weakness he did not know he possessed. Arena fell completely silent, and 3,000 spectators stared in disbelief at the scene before them. The legendary Instructor Vaughn was stumbling and coughing, and one of his arms hung limp at his side. Small human stood exactly where she had been, and her breathing had not even changed. Commander Sek rose from his seat, and his gray face showed genuine shock. He had expected the human to lose quickly, and he had been prepared to intervene if Vaughn became too aggressive. He had not expected this one. Recovered his balance, and his amber eyes blazed with emotions that the crowd had never seen from the composed instructor. Anger and confusion, and something that might have been the first stirrings of fear. "Lucky strikes," he rasped, and his voice was rougher than before from the throat hit. "You will not touch me again." He abandoned the formal demonstration stance and dropped into the combat posture that Draxians used in actual warfare, his tail lashed behind him for balance, and all four arms coiled like serpents ready to strike. Yuna watched him with that same steady gaze and made no move to attack or retreat. "You are changing the rules," she observed, and her tone carried no accusation. "Demonstration protocols do not include killing stances. You changed them first when you actually hit me. You asked me to show you human combat, and I showed you 3 examples." She tilted her head, slightly like a predator examining prey. "We can stop here if you prefer and call this a learning experience for the cadets." Vaughn's response was a roar of fury, and he launched himself at her with genuine killing intent. The crowd gasped, and several instructors shouted for the match to stop, but Commander Sek held up his hand. Something told him that the human was not actually in danger, and he wanted to see what happened next to an Ahmet. Vaughn's charged with movement that flowed like water around stone. She did not retreat or stand her ground, but instead circled around his attacks and struck at exposed points while he overextended her. Techniques were nothing like the martial arts the Coalition had documented from human broadcasts. Those had seemed flashy and impractical and full of unnecessary movement. This was something older and more efficient and designed purely to cause damage. Vaughn swung all 4 arms in a sweeping attack meant to catch her no matter which direction she dodged. Yuna dropped flat to the floor and swept his leading leg from beneath him. Draxian stumbled, and she was already rising with an elbow strike to his lower back that made him arch in pain. He spun with his tail whipping toward her head, and she ducked beneath it and punched the base of his spine where the spine were defined where the spider tail connected. Van screamed. The sound echoed through the arena and froze everyone in place, because no one had ever heard that noise from a Draxian warrior. Orthos covered her ears as the telepathic backlash of Vaughn's pain washed over her sensitive mind. She had felt injuries before during her training, but nothing like this concentrated, precise agony. The human was not just hitting random targets, and she was attacking the same nerve clusters repeatedly to accumulate damage that compounded with each strike. Vaughn turned and finally managed to land a blow. His upper left arm caught Yuna across the ribs, and the impact sent her sliding across the arena floor. She rolled with the momentum and came up on her feet, but blood now dripped from a split in her lip. The crowd held its breath. First, blood had been drawn, and surely now the human would realize she was outmatched. Yuna wiped the blood from her lip and looked at the crimson on her fingers. With an expression of mild curiosity, something shifted in her eyes, and the cadets closest to the ring instinctively leaned backward. One of the Draxian instructors in the senior section stood abruptly, and his scales had gone pale. "That expression," he said to the colleagues beside him, and his voice trembled slightly. "I have seen it before in predator species just before they make a kill." Vaughn saw the change as well, and for the first time genuine doubt crept into his mind. The human had been fighting at what he now realized was a restrained level, as she had been holding back even while landing devastating strikes. Now that restraint was gone. "I was teaching you," Yuna said, and her quiet voice carried across the silent arena. "Every strike was meant to show you where your defenses fail against a human opponent." She shifted her stance, and her weight settled lower, and her hands came up in a different guard position. "You drew blood, so the lesson is over." Vaughn rallied his courage and refused to show fear before his students. "I have fought across a dozen worlds, human, and I have defeated every species in this coalition. You have never fought something from a death world that wanted you dead." Yuna began to move forward, and there was nothing flowing or graceful about her approach. Now each step was direct and purposeful, and her eyes never blinked as she closed the distance. Humans evolved on a planet that tried to kill us every single day, and everything on our world was faster or stronger or more venomous than we were. She was inside his reach before he could mount a defense, and her fist drove into his solar plexus with force that should have been impossible from her small frame. We survive because we learned to hurt things that should have killed us, and we learned to keep fighting long after any reasonable creature would have stopped. Vaughn doubled over, and she grabbed two of his arms and twisted them against their joints. He screamed again and tried to grab her with his free arms, but she had positioned herself perfectly in his blind spot. Your species has natural weapons and armor and reach and strength, she continued as she wrenched his arms further. My species has 10,000 years of learning exactly how to destroy things that have all those advantages. She released him suddenly and stepped back as he collapsed to his knees. Commander Sek finally moved forward to stop the match, but Yuna held up one hand. He started this fight and he needs to decide how it ends. She looked down at the gasping Draxian with something that might have been respect. Yield now and walk away with your reputation mostly intact, or continue and learn exactly how much damage a human can absorb before we stop fighting. Vaughn looked up at her with hatred burning in his amber eyes. His pride would not allow him to surrender before his students, and his pain would not allow him to think clearly. He chose wrong. He surged to his feet with all four arms reaching for the human's throat, and Yuna's expression did not change. She simply nodded once as if she had expected this answer. Very well, she said, and the real fight began. The training arena on Station Volantos could hold 3,000 spectators, and today every seat was filled with cadets from across the Galactic Coalition. Sergeant Yuna Park stood at the edge of the sparring ring and watched the crowd with calm eyes that revealed nothing of her thoughts. She was shorter than almost everyone in the room, and her compact build made her look even smaller next to the towering aliens who trained at this prestigious military academy. The Draxian stood nearly 3 meters tall with 4 powerful arms and scales that could deflect blade strikes. The Krylosi were built like living tanks with gray armored skin and muscles designed for crushing force. The Volani were slender and graceful, but their telepathic abilities made them dangerous opponents who could predict enemy movements. And then there was Yuna Park, who looked like she might break if any of these species decided to shake her hand too. Firmly, Commander Dorvan Sek of the Krylosi walked to the center of the arena and raised his massive arms for silence. Today we witness a demonstration of human close combat techniques, he announced, and his deep voice carried across the chamber without any need for amplification. The Coalition has recently admitted humans to our military exchange program, and Sergeant Park has volunteered to showcase her species' combat methods. Ripple of quiet conversation moved through the crowd, and Yuna did not need telepathic abilities to know what they were saying. Humans were new to the galactic community, and most species still considered them primitive newcomers who had barely mastered faster than light travel. Their homeworld was classified as a Category 7 death world, but many Coalition members dismissed this as exaggeration. After all, how dangerous could a species be if they had no claws and no venom and no natural armor and no ability to regenerate lost limbs? Instructor Kethril Vaughn stepped forward from the senior staff section, and the cadets immediately fell silent. Vaughn was a legend at the academy, and his four-armed fighting style had never been defeated in 40 cycles of teaching. He stood before Commander Sek and gave a formal bow that barely concealed his contempt. "Commander, I must raise a concern," Vaughn said, and his voice carried the rasping quality of all Draxian speech. "A demonstration against training drones will prove nothing about human combat effectiveness in real situations." Sek narrowed his eyes, but nodded for Vaughn to continue. "I propose that Sergeant Park demonstrate her techniques against a live opponent," Vaughn said, and he turned to look directly at the human with all four of his amber eyes. "I volunteer myself for this purpose so that we may see an accurate assessment of human capabilities." The crowd erupted in excited murmurs, and several instructors exchanged worried glances. Everyone knew what Vaughn was doing, and it was not subtle. He wanted to embarrass the human in front of the entire academy. and proved that the exchange program was a waste of resources. Commander. Sec looked at Yuna with what might have been concern. Sergeant Park, this was meant to be a simple demonstration against automated targets, and you are under no obligation to accept Instructor Vaughn's challenge. Yuna finally moved, and she walked to the center of the ring with steps that made no sound on the metal floor. I accept, she said, and her voice was quiet but carried perfectly in the sudden silence. Evans' forearms flexed with anticipation, and his tail swept across the floor in the Draxian expression of satisfaction. Excellent, he said, and positioned himself across from the human. Let us show these cadets what real combat looks like. Cadet Morel Thomases sat in the front row of the observation section, and her silver eyes never left the human sergeant. Of Alani, she possessed moderate telepathic sensitivity, and she had been assigned to document this exchange program for Coalition records. She reached out with her mind, expecting to feel the fear and anxiety that any reasonable being would experience when facing Instructor Vaughn. Instead, she felt nothing, not emptiness, but stillness, like the surface of deep water that concealed unknown depths below. The human's mind was not panicking or calculating escape routes or desperately reviewing combat techniques. It was simply waiting. Thos leaned forward in her seat and activated her recording device because she suddenly felt certain that something unexpected was about to happen. Commander. Sec raised one massive arm between the two combatants. Standard demonstration rules apply, he announced. First to score 3 successful strikes is declared the winner, and all force must remain non-lethal. He looked between the towering Draxian and the small human, and for a moment, something like doubt crossed his gray features. Begin. He stepped back, and Vaughn immediately pressed forward with all 4 arms extended in a guard position that had defeated countless opponents. The Draxian's reach advantage was enormous, and his fighting style used all 4 limbs in coordinated patterns that overwhelmed enemy defenses. He threw the first combination of strikes, and his upper arm swept in wide arcs, while his lower arms jabbed at the center. It was a technique that forced opponents to choose which attacks to block and inevitably left openings for follow-up strikes. Yuna did not block any of them. She simply was not there when the strikes arrived, and she had moved with small efficient steps that required almost no visible effort. Vaughn pressed harder, and his attacks came faster as he tried to corner the human against the edge of the ring. She continued to evade, and her movements were so minimal that she seemed to be barely trying. The crowd began to murmur again, and this time the tone was dismissive. She's simply running away, someone said loudly enough to carry across the arena. Humans have no actual combat ability, and she knows she cannot win. Vaughn heard these comments, and his confidence grew with every passing moment. The human was faster than he expected, but speed meant nothing if she could not actually fight back. He increased the pressure and drove her across the ring with relentless 4-armed assaults. 2 minutes passed, and Yuna had not thrown a single attack. She had not even raised her hands in a defensive posture, and she simply continued her flowing, evasive movement. Van paused and allowed contempt to drip from his rasping voice. Is this human combat technique? He asked the crowd and gestured at Yuna with all 4 arms, running and hiding like prey animals on their death world. Laughter echoed through the arena, and several cadets openly mocked the human. Sergeant Thos watched Yuna's face and saw no reaction to the insults, but she noticed something that others had missed throughout the entire 2 minutes of evasion. The human's eyes had never left Vaughn's feet. She was not running in panic, and she was not simply surviving until the match ended. She was watching and learning and waiting for something specific. Yuna spoke for the first time since the match began, and her quiet voice somehow cut through the laughter. I was being polite, she said, and there was no anger or defensiveness in her tone. You wanted to see human combat techniques, and I was giving you the chance to reconsider. Vaughn snarled, and his forearms tensed for another assault. Reconsider what exactly? Una met his amber eyes with her dark, steady gaze. This was supposed to be a demonstration, and demonstrations are controlled and safe for everyone involved. She shifted her stance and for the first time raised her hands into a guard position that Vaughn did. Not recognize. You turned it into a real fight when you volunteered, and real fights are not controlled. Are you threatening me, little human? Una shook her head slowly. I am asking if you are certain you want to see how humans actually fight, because we did not evolve on a death world by being gentle. Vaughn laughed, and the crowd laughed with him. Show me everything you have, human, and I will show you why the Draxians have never been conquered. He lunged forward with all four arms, ready to finally end this farce, thought the change before she saw it, and the stillness in the human's mind shattered like glass breaking into 1,000 sharp pieces. Something else emerged from beneath that calm surface, and it was old and patient and utterly. Without mercy, the Villani cadet gripped her seat and realized she was about to witness something the Academy had never seen before.